The true history of what didn't happen. Perhaps the biggest problem in combining history and fantasy is separating those things in the first place. Just as looking closely at a solid object will reveal a sea of atoms made of quarks, themselves composed of insubstantial probabilities, so too will solid history, on close inspection, often yield a boundless desert of apparent facts made of contemporary biases, themselves composed of insubstantial suppositions. It could well be argued that our histories, along with all our current scientific models of reality, are an ingenious fantasy that has been stretched to fit the awkward jutting contours of the world as we now understand it, to provide us with a narrative, a story of ourselves that sounds almost believable and doesn't have too many yawning inconsistencies. When you get down to it, when you look close enough, our whole existence is made out of only stories. Fact and fantasy, since our first outing as a species, have been scrambled up together inextricably, like a bad day in the matter transmitter. Ancient Greeks believed a number of the combatants at the historic siege of Troy to have been second-generation gods, and even by the 14th century, Western astronomers adhered, on threat of burning, to a system where the stars and other planets all revolved around the Earth. Until Victorian times, historians were impeded by a world barely 6,000 years in age as calculated from the genealogy of Adam. For the greater part of human social evolution, we have not been able or have felt no need to differentiate between the fabulous and the historical, as if we would prefer a shot of each in our cocktail of being. Perfectly exemplifying our storybook tendencies regarding matters of chronology, the wildly speculative monk Geoffrey of Monmouth, in 1138, compiled his comprehensive History of the Kings of Britain out of very few established facts and a great undiscriminating avalanche of folklore. Here we learn that Britain was originally Brutane, named for Brutus, great-grandson of Aeneas, who had fought at Troy, and therefore a direct descendant of the goddess Venus. Guided to discover Britain by a dream or vision, the globe-trotting Brutus finds a race of giants ruled by their ferocious king Gog-Magog, or sometimes Gog-Magog. Defeating these by having his best wrestler throw Gog-Magog over a cliff, there's still a Cornwall precipice called Gog-Magog's Leap, Brutus goes on to found London, which he names as Troia Nova, or New Troy, rather than Trinovantium after the Trinavante fishermen who were historically its first inhabitants. The deity-descended warrior next sires a line of kings including Bladud, Lud, Belinus, Shakespeare's Lear or Lear, and, as you might expect, King Arthur with his devil-fathered court magician Merlin. Obviously, none of the above or anything remotely like it ever took place, yet this was the wobbly founding stone of English history. In their conflation of the actual and mythological, the ancient Greeks, Renaissance papacy, and even credulous Geoffrey of Monmouth can claim the excuse of scientific ignorance and or ecclesiastical indoctrination. They quite possibly believed they were illuminating all mankind with their best guess at what might have occurred, this noble goal providing all their motive. But what of our present-day authors of fantasy or science fiction, most of whom have benefited from a modern education and don't happen to be living in a punitive theocracy, who therefore have no such excuse? Why would someone deliberately attempt to smudge the boundary between the real and the invented, unless as willful deception or insidious disinformation strategy, if they knew better? At this point, the more perceptive reader may have realised that, while generalising about writers of imaginative fiction as a nebulous collective, I am mostly speaking of and trying desperately to exonerate myself. My probably unsafe defence is the belief that in constructing fantasies, we are engaged in building the most fragile of all artifice, attempting to create a solid-seeming world and characters by knitting fog, by weaving something of apparent weight and volume from a vaporous material which we know isn't really there. This is perhaps why fantasy may seem to be the easiest of fields, because it has no rules and you just make everything up, while in fact being the most difficult of genres to deploy successfully, because it has no rules and you just make everything up. In any work of fiction, it is vitally important that the reader should remain invested in the world and situations that the tale presents to them. And in a vaguely defined area like fantasy, it can be all too easy for essential things like motivation, logic, and plot resolution to evaporate into prismatic steam, leaving the narrative ungrounded and without sufficient gravity to pull the audience into its orbit. If it is not to float away into the ether, fantasy needs to be freighted with the ballast of the true and the incontrovertible. Depending on the yarn in question, this truth may need only to be emotional and empathetic, where no matter how unrecognizable the setting, there remains about the characters a human resonance with which the reader can identify. But other fantasies, particularly those purporting to take place in a historic past, while they will still require dramatic figures that are memorable and affecting, will need something else as well. This being a near watertight verisimilitude that does not clash with the established record, nor, for fables set more recently, with what the readership themselves might still remember. Crafting this kind of veracity, however, will necessitate a delicate re-engineering of reality, so as to comfortably accommodate the author's unbelievable extravagances and plain lies. This is most usually referred to as suspension of the reader's disbelief, although, for my tastes, mere suspension goes nowhere near far enough, as if politely asking disbelief to wait outside the room until we finished reading. For my own part, I'd prefer an utter demolition of belief itself, placing the readers into an uncanny territory where they are no longer certain what is actual and what is imaginary. Naturally, across the decades, one accumulates a repertoire of techniques by which this may be accomplished, although none that don't entail a mountain of obscure research. While working on my Whitechapel confection, From Hell, I learned that the most inconsequential scrap of evidence can be manipulated until it apparently supports the most outrageous of hypotheses. The fact that under Cleopatra's Needle is encysted a time capsule containing a straight razor, photographs of the Victorian era's most beautiful women, and a railway map of London is, in itself, meaningless. But if this detail is remarked upon by an urban geography-obsessed Freemason who is also Jack the Ripper, it acquires an ominous importance and contributes greatly to an atmosphere of gathering unease. In shaping the Long London series, this propensity has seemingly gone into overdrive. A well-supported rumour that the head of alleged Ratcliffe Highway murderer John Williams was presented in a nearby public house, the Crown and Dolphin, along with the stolen cranium of visionary philosopher Emanuel Swedenborg, is talked up into my alternate capital's de facto government. The information that an ancient pagan maypole in the Strand was used by Isaac Newton as a plinth on which to mount his telescope provides this higher London with a startlingly phallic and astronomy-based item of street furniture. And just how literally Arthur Machen had intended his conceit that there's a truer world concealed behind our own gifts the quintet with its most crucial central concept. Of course, this endeavour, the conflation of the verified with the impossible, is much assisted if one chooses real-life personages who already teeter on the brink of their own dubious mythologies. Ironfoot Jack Neve's ludicrous and constantly changing explanations for the way in which he'd lost most of one leg can be construed as cover stories for him having stepped unwisely into a distorting ripple called an anamorphic wave. Prince Monolulu's almost supernatural stroke of luck at 1920's Epsom Derby, in a certain light, could seem as if there's no almost about it. And when looking for delirious fantasists whose stated life experiences have long since strayed beyond the boundaries of the possible, one might think to include a couple of magicians. Dion Fortune and Aleister Crowley, separately, claimed encounters with a supernatural feline, as did doomed record producer Joe Meek, which might tempt the question, what if they were all one cat? And leads directly to the genesis of Charming Peter. Austin Spare's life was a torrent of unlikelihood, even without Kenneth Grant's mystical embellishments, and Spare's art certainly appears to be informed by visions of another, different world. These lives and stories are a jeweled cement to fill inevitable cracks in our mundane account, transforming it into a seamless occult marvel. This attempt at the erasure of a line dividing the unearthly and the realistic, implemented by making the everyday sublime and the sublime convincingly authentic, is a means by which the reader and the writer both can step beyond the world and its restricting backstory into a past and future with no limits to the possible, into an unexplored realm where Geoffrey of Monmouth's Gog and Magog, confused with biblical giants Gog and Magog, can first become carven gateposts to the city and end up running a fruit and veg stall on Berwick Street Market, fusing history and fantasy into an amalgam, as if we had ever done things any other way.